Have you ever felt too small to make a difference? As if your history is not relevant, or your past cancels out what God can do in your present? If yes, then this message is for you. Imagine a simple young girl, an orphan, raised by a cousin, living in a foreign land, without prestige or position. Now imagine the same young woman being chosen by God to change the course of history for his people. This isn't a fairy tale, it's pure Bible. In the midst of an empire dominated by political intrigue and immutable laws, Esther emerges as an unlikely figure. She didn't seek prominence. He wasn't looking for a throne. But when the need knocked on the door, his faith, courage, and obedience paved the way for the divine purpose. It was not without fear, nor without a fight that was fast. There was silence. There were tears. And also a deliverance surprising coming from God's providence. Esther's story shows us that God can use anyone, anywhere, at any time. Yes, he still uses ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things. Maybe you think, but am nobody, and I tell you perfect. That's exactly what Esther thought too. What changed his trajectory was his willingness to trust God, even without guarantees. In this content, we will delve into the details of this epic plot: proud kings, deposed queens, wicked villains like Haman, and a plan of salvation that could only be born from the heart of God. You will see how each character was a fundamental piece on the divine board, including Mordecai, the man who dared to challenge the system for the love of truth. Prepare to be amazed. Leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any content. More than an ancient story, the Book of Esther is a handbook of eternal principles on how to live with loyalty, how to endure God's silence, and how to act when everything is at risk. It's no coincidence that this book is in the Biblite, carries a call if you've been placed in this position. Perhaps it is for such a time as this. Shall we find out together? The setting of Esther's story is a great Persian empire, a world power that dominated from India to Ethiopia. It was a time when kings had absolute power and royal decrees could not be revoked. In this vast empire lived the Jews, a people who had already faced exile for their disobedience to God. The promised land was left behind, but the loyalty of the Lord remained present even in the midst of dispersion. Many Jews had been taken captive to Babylon years before because of their rebellion against the ways of the Lord. It was the price of disobedience, something the Bible warns about repeatedly. However, the God's providence, it was already starting to move. Even in the midst of pain, the divine plan was never out of control. The story of Esther begins exactly in this context of apparent oblivion. When King Cyrus of Persia conquers Babylon, he allows the Jews to return to Jerusalem. But, interestingly, many decide to stay where they are. This may seem strange, but it is common to become attached to the place where you built a new life. Esther and Mordecai are part of this group that stays in Persia, and that is exactly where the divine purpose unfolds. God writes correctly even through crooked lines. While many felt they were too far gone for God to use, he was just laying the groundwork. Life in exile seemed far from Israel's promises, but the Lord does not need territory to work miracles. The faith it was still alive, even if muffled, in silence. Heaven plotted a deliverance that would change the destiny of an entire nation. The Persian Empire was a mix of cultures, religions, and strict laws. It was not an easy environment for a faithful Jew, as Mordecai, who needed to balance his loyalty to God with the pressures of a pagan court. Still, God's people knew they could not negotiate their principles. This becomes even clearer as the story progresses. When everything seemed lost, the chance for sacrifice generates salvation. This background is essential to understanding what comes next. The story of Esther, it's not just a pretty tale. It is a record of the Lord's invisible actions behind the scenes of human history. When it seems like God is silent, he is just setting the stage. And the most incredible thing, he likes to use people who no one expects. Exile was not the end, it was the beginning of a supernatural move. Let's start with Esther, the heart of this story. A beautiful young woman. But not just on the outside her grace, discretion and intelligence caught the eye. Orphaned since childhood, she was raised by her cousin Mordecai, who treated her like a daughter. Even without title, power, or wealth, she was chosen by God for a great mission. And detailed at the beginning, no one knew she was Jewish, a strategy that would only make sense later. Mordecai, he is a type of man who inspires respect. A God-fearing Jew, righteous to the last hair, he refused to bow before any man, even if it cost him dearly. He was the one who took care of Esther with zeal and wisdom, and his influence was decisive in shaping her character. Mordecai is an example of loyalty, obedience, and silent courage. Without him, none of this would have happened. The king of the time was Ahasuerus, also known as Xerxes, a powerful man, but very influenceable, surrounded by sycophants and self-serving advisors. His mood changed with the wind, and this made him an unstable leader. It was this instability that caused the fall of his first wife, Queen Vashti, and opened the way for Esther. Ahasuerus represents those who have power, but not discernment, and God knows how to use even this to fulfill his plans. A Queen Vashti deserves attention. She was deposed for refusing to obey a reckless order from the king, who wanted to display her as a trophy in front of his drunken guests. His attitude was courageous, but it cost him his title. This shows how, in the Persian court, women were treated as objects until God placed Esther on that throne. Vashti leaves the scene, but her courage makes room for something bigger. And then the villain appears, Haman, the classic type of enemy disguised as a good man. He rose through the palace ranks until he became the king's right-hand man. But behind the pose, there was a deadly hatred for Jews, especially for Mordecai, who refused to revere him. Haman's pride blinded him, and his obsession with power led him to devise a plan of genocide. One detail, he had no idea who Esther really was. Each of these characters represents something deeper. Esther, the courage that flourishes in anonymity. Mordecai, the voice that calls for justice. Ahasuerus, power without direction. Vast, wounded dignity. Haman, the ego that turns into ruin. Knowing these figures prepares us to understand how God, even without being directly mentioned in the book, masterfully leads each step. The story is just beginning. After the fall of Queen Vashti, the king Ahasuerus orders an empire-wide beauty contest. It was like an imperial reality show, where girls from various provinces would be groomed to perhaps become queen. Among them was Esther, simple, Jewish, and without political ambition, but with a brilliance that no one could ignore. Her beauty enchanted, but it was her grace, humility, and wisdom that touched the king's heart. God was working behind the scenes. The Bible says that she found favor in the eyes of everyone who saw her. In a world where appearance was everything, Esther stood out for something that went beyond the physical. And even amid perfumes, myrrh baths, and jewelry, she maintained her essence. His discreet and obedient posture towards Mordecai, it was what kept her going. She concealed her Jewish identity, following his vicious decision that would later prove crucial to her deliverance of your people. While other competitors tried to impress with exaggerations, Esther acted naturally. The person responsible for the harem favored Esther without really understanding why. This shows how the God's providence operates even in the details. God was preparing someone for within the palace for a heavenly plane. She didn't enter that place for nothing. There was a divine purpose clear, even if hidden at that moment. When the day of presentation to the king arrived, Esther asked for nothing more than what was necessary. Instead of relying on adornments, she trusted in God's direction, even if silent. The king was enchanted by her like never before. And there, in front of thousands of candidates, Esther was crowned as the new queen of Persia. A Jew, daughter of exile, assumed a throne that would change the course of history. It's interesting how God can use unlikely situations to put someone in the right place. Who would have thought that a young orphan captive would become queen? But that's where the divine touch comes in. God does not need human logic to carry out his plans. What he seeks is loyalty and willingness to obey, even when nothing makes sense. Esther became an instrument of something much bigger than she herself could imagine. In the palace, Esther not only wore a crown, but carried an invisible mission. She didn't know it yet, but she had been chosen to be the link between heaven and her people. Everything seemed calm, like it was just a beautiful ascension story. But behind the scenes, evil moved in soon. The true test of his power, faith, courage, and sacrifice would come to light. Because where there is purpose, there is also opposition. The problem started when Mordecai, true to convictions, refused to bow before Haman. This simple act, which for many would be just etiquette, was seen by Haman as a personal affront. Wounded pride turned to hatred, and not just against Mordecai, but against the entire Jewish people. Haman wanted more than revenge. He wanted to exterminate an entire nation. And so began a Machiavellian plan, born of vanity and fueled by power. With manipulative ability, Haman convinced the king Ahasuerus that the Jews were a different and dangerous people for the kingdom. He offered a huge sum of silver to the king in exchange for permission to kill all the Jews in the empire. Without question, the king trusted blindly once again, showing how easily he was influenced. The decree was signed, sealed with a royal ring, and spread throughout the kingdom. The day of destruction was set. Imagine the shock of the Jewish people upon learning this. It wasn't just a chase, it was a death sentence, with a set date and official permission, all because of loyalty of a man who refused to compromise his principles. And the most tragic, the king had no idea that his own Queen Esther was Jewish. The decree wasn't just against a distant peeplite, it was against the king's own wife. But the plan was still hidden. The evil of Haman, it was so refined that he even built a gallows more than 20 meters long to kill Mordecai. It was as if he wanted to not just destroy, but publicly humiliate. Meanwhile, he walked proudly through the palace, thinking his plan was foolproof. But what Haman didn't know is that God was already moving the pieces behind the scenes. The divine providence, it was operating, albeit silently. This moment is a warning for us often. The enemy seems to be winning. Plans are made, decrees are signed, threats are made, and it seems that God is silent. But make no mistake, heaven never panics. While evil arms, God prepares response. What seemed like the end for the Jews was actually the beginning of a great deliverance, because God's plan never fails. With the decree signed and enemies ready to attack, the stage was set for a spiritual confrontation. The faith of a people would be tested, and the fate of a nation would depend on the courage of a woman. Esther still didn't know how to react, but the call to courage and the sacrifice was approaching. War would not be with swords, but with fasting, crying, and obedience. When the decree exterminating the Jews was published, Mordecai reacted with pain and urgency. He tore his clothes, covered himself with sackcloth and ashes, a symbolic gesture of mourning and supplication before God. This wasn't just despair, it was intercession. Mordecai knew that only divine providence could reverse that decree, and he decided that it wasn't enough to regret, it was time to act, even without knowing the end of the story. He sent messages to Esther, asking him to intercede before the king. The queen, however, hesitated. She knew that entering the king's presence without being called could mean death. The law was clear, and even she as queen was at risk. It was time to choose between the comfort of the palace or the divine purpose. Mordecai then sends one of the most striking lines in the Bible. Who knows if it was for a time like this that you became king? This sentence fell like lightning into Esther's heart. She understood that her title, beauty, and position were not just coincidence. God had put her there for a purpose, and she couldn't remain silent. It was then that Esther made a decision that would change everything, risking her own life. But before acting, she asked the Jewish people to do something fundamental fast. For 3 days and nights, no one would eat or drink anything, neither her nor her servants. It was a spiritual battle. When everything seems out of control, the fast is a silent scream that moves the sky. It's not magic, but surrender. Esther, he understood that the answer would first come in the spiritual world, before manifesting itself in the king's palace. And there began the greatest war the Persian Empire had ever seen, a war made of prayer, silence, and trust. Then, with a strengthened soul, Esther said a phrase that echoes to this day: "If I perish, I perish." This statement is not one of defeat, but a surrender. She decided that living or dying was no longer the issue, obeying God was. This is the essence of sacrifice, giving up personal security for something greater. Esther became more than queen at that moment. She became an intercessor for a nation. His attitude teaches us that there are times when fear needs to be confronted with action, that the faith, the truth, does not wait for ideal conditions. It acts even in the face of risk. Courage, it is not the absence of fear, but the decision not to let yourself be paralyzed by it. Esther understood that her life was an instrument in the hands of God, and this was only possible because she chose the obedience rather than self-preservation. While Haman was filled with pride at the temporary success of his plans, something unexpected began to happen. That night, the king Ahasuerus, he had insomnia, and instead of asking for music or entertainment, he ordered the historical records of the kingdom to be brought. Coincidence? None of that. It was the God's providence acting behind the scenes. Upon rereading the records, the king discovered that Mordecai he had saved his life years before and had never been rewarded. This simple reading changed everything. The king, touched by a belated sense of justice, decides to honor Mordecai immediately. But see the ironic touch, he asks precisely to Haman, his declared enemy, what should one do to a man the king wishes to honor? Thinking that the king was talking about him, Haman suggests royal treatment, the king's robes, a royal horse, and a parade through the streets. The ego spoke louder, and the trap became a blessing. Imagine a scene of Haman, who planned to hang Mordecai, is now forced to publicly lead him through the streets, loudly proclaiming his honor. What divine irony! The man who engineered the downfall of a righteous man was now the herald of his exaltation. This shows that God has a sense of humor and justice at the same time. When you stay fell, God honors you in a way that even your enemies recognize. As Haman returned home humiliated, Mordecai leveled up. He who fasted, who cried, who seemed invisible, was now exalted. And this happened without him needing to defend himself or fight with his own hands. The deliverance, it came by the hand of God at the right time in the most unlikely way. Because when you walk under divine purpose, not even the force prepared against you prospers. This episode reveals that God does not forget the righteous. It may seem like no one sees you loyalty, that his good deeds went unnoticed, but God is attentive, and at the right time he honors. Sometimes promotion comes disguised as a problem, and recognition comes from where you least expect it. While the world lays traps, heaven prepares honor for those who remain firm, even in silence. The turnaround was just beginning. If Mordecai was exalted, the next step will be the fall of Haman. And all of this was connected to the courage and obedience of a woman who chose to fast and take action. When God is in control, even a king's insomnia becomes a tool of heaven. The gallows that seemed to be the end would soon become an instrument of justice. Now, Esther had the perfect setting to act boldly. The time has come when Esther comes into action. After fasting and spiritual preparation, she decides to go to the king without being called a bold act, full of faith and risk. But to everyone's surprise, the king receives her with favor and extends a royal scepter. God's wisdom guided every detail, and instead of acting hastily, Esther invites the king and Haman for a banquet. Yes, she preferred to act strategically, not desperately. At the first banquet, the king asks her what she wants, and she calmly responds, "Come to another banquet tomorrow." Does it seem strange? In fact, Esther was waiting for the right moment, the Kairos God's perfect timing. About that, Haman, thinking he was being honored, left excited. Little did he know that the honor at the banquets was only the prelude to his downfall. The divine providence acted in silence. At the second banquet, with the atmosphere now more intimate, the king again insists that Esther place your order. Then she reveals her true identity: "I am Jewish, and a plan was made to exterminate my people." The shocked king demands to know who would dare do this. Esther points her finger firmly and courageously at this man, Haman. It was a turning point, a queen revealing her origins and the enemy being unmasked. The king's reaction was explosive. He stormed out into the garden and returned to find Haman fallen on Esther's couch, begging for mercy. The king understood this as an attack on his queen and became even more angry. One of the servants revealed Haman prepared a gallows for Mordecai. That was the trigger. Haman was hanged, precisely on the gallows that he himself had built. Poetic justice? This part of the story shows how the courage combined with wisdom produces great victories. Esther didn't rush. She didn't get excited. She waited for the ideal moment, trusting in God's faithfulness. While the villain was exalted, God was preparing his fall. This teaches us that there are times when we need to act firmly, but also with discernment. Not all victories come with shouting, some come with feasts. In the end, the one who wanted to destroy became an example of what happens to those who defy God's plans. Haman was silenced, and Esther remained firm in his divine purpose. This wasn't luck, it was spiritual direction. When we put our trust in the Lord and follow with obedience, He makes everything work together for good. And so, a dinner became the stage for deliverance for an entire people. Even after the fall of Haman, the problem was still not resolved. The decree authorizing the death of the Jews remained valid, and according to Persian law, an order from the king could not be revoked. This shows that sometimes spiritual victory comes, but there are still practical battles to face. That's when Esther, once again with courage, interceded with the king for his people. And the king, now more aware, gave it another chance. As Eurus authorized a second decree, now the Jews could defend themselves, organize themselves, and protect their lives against any attack. It was a complete turnaround from passive victims to active defenders. Here we see once again the God's providence. He not only delivers, but also empowers. The Jewish people, previously vulnerable, now received legal support to fight. And when God allows you to fight, it is because He has already guaranteed your victory. When the day set for the attack arrived, the enemies of the Jews were surprised. They were prepared, united, and given royal permission to resist. Strength came not only from weapons, but from renewed trust in the deliverance divine. They won not because they were the strongest, but because they were at the center of the God's purpose. Sometimes winning just means being in the right place, with the right heart and the right faith. This victory did not go unnoticed, so that future generations would never forget what God did. The Feast of Purim, a day of celebration, joy and gratitude for miraculous salvation. And to this day, Jews celebrate this date remembering that a fast, a courageous queen, and a God's faithfulness changed the course of history. An almost annihilated people became an exalted people. Purim, it is more than a party. It is a memorial that God acts when everything seems lost. How many times have you felt like those people? No way out, with contrary decrees, no strength to fight? But God has the power to transform persecution into protection, a decree of death into a declaration of life. Just as the Jews found strength in victory, you too can experience your own Purim. Just trust. The story ends not with tragedy, but with restoration. What was a reason for fear became a reason for celebration. The enemy was defeated. The people were strengthened and God's name was glorified. This reminds that faith, courage, obedience, and purpose, they're not just pretty words, they're keys to rewriting destinies. And now, with the people at peace, all that was left was to recognize God really was in control all along. The story of Esther shows us clearly and powerfully that God never fails to fulfill His divine purposes. He used a young Jewish girl with no power or influence to save an entire people. Esther's story is a reminder that even in the most difficult situations, when we surrender God's faithfulness, He acts in unexpected and miraculous ways. If you feel insignificant or powerless, remember that with God, your life has a much greater purpose than you realize. Esther's example teaches us about courage, obedience, and sacrifice. Esther did not hesitate to risk her life for something bigger than herself, the good of her people. When we make decisions based on faith and trust in God, we can expect great transformations. Esther not only defeated her people's enemies, but also caused all the Jews around her to experience deliverance. One person's courage can impact an entire nation. History still teaches us that God can use anyone to carry out His plans. We don't need to be big or powerful to make a difference. Mordecai, with his fidelity to God and his wise guidance to Esther, also played a crucial role in the development of events. True strength comes from being aligned with God's will. Sometimes, what seems like an ordinary life, full of challenges, is actually preparation for a great divine purpose. The deliverance of Esther and her people is a clear example that God never gives up on us. He's always working behind the scenes, even when we don't see it. Even when everything seems lost, as in the case of the death decree, God finds ways to turn the situation in our favor. When we trust in Him, He guides us, protects us, and gives us victory, even in the most unlikely situations. Finally, the story of Esther is not just an ancient narrative, but an invitation to live with faith and courage. Perhaps you are at a crossroads in life, not knowing which path to take. Remember, when you put your plans in God's hands, He can do something great. Esther risked everything in obedience to the Lord, and the reward was a deliverance that impacted generations. Don't underestimate what God can do in your life. like this Purim is celebrated to this day, our faith in God must be constant. He is a God who saves, restores, and fulfills his plans. It doesn't matter how big the obstacle ahead is if you walk with him, as Esther did. You will see the deliverance and others' divine providence in action. May Esther's story inspire you to live with courage, trusting that God will use your life for something extraordinary. Now, think, how can you live with more courage and faith in your daily life? Are you ready to trust God's plan for your life, just like Esther did? If you felt that this message touched your heart, be sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any more content like this. Share this video with friends who need this word and help us spread God's hope and deliverance.